Hi, this is the first of 2 short lectures on Chapter 1. If you've already read the chapter, you'll recognize the terms and definitions that I've included here, but I dropped them in just so we would keep them in mind while we were reviewing the poem by W.B. Yeats, The Lake Isle of Innisfree. Looking at this poem will help us become more comfortable with paraphrasing poems. A note before we start: the voice in the poem is referred to typically as the speaker, and we shouldn't assume that the voice in a poem always belongs to the poet or represents the poet's beliefs and feelings, although sometimes the speaker does. And we'll return to this concept in Chapter 2. But for now, let's look at the Yeats poem. The Lake Isle of Innisfree. I will arise and go now, and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin build there, of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows will I have there, a hive for the honey bee, and live alone in the bee-loud glade. And I shall have some peace there, for peace comes dropping slow, dropping from the vales of the morning to where the cricket sings. There midnight's all a glimmer, and noon a purple glow, and evening full of the linnet's wings. I will arise and go now, for always night and day I hear lake water lapping with low sounds by the shore, while I stand on the roadway, or on the pavement's gray, I hear it in the deep heart's core. Now, a tip when you're reading a poem and you recognize words but you're not quite sure what they mean, or you encounter words that you haven't encountered before, you should have a dictionary and look up those words, because that really will add to the meaning of the poem. So in this case, if you weren't familiar with wattles or linnets or other words, you should look them up, although our book gives us definitions. So notice when you look at the poem, how much of it describes the isle and the speaker's desire to go there. This signals to us that the subject is the isle and/or the speaker's longing to go to it. Notice also that the poem contrasts the Lake Isle life with city life. See how in the first line of the second stanza, the word peace shows up twice. And that's contrasted with the roadway and pavement's gray of city life. This contrast signals that the theme is the speaker's yearning for an ideal place where they will find peace and happiness. So if we're looking at this poem and we want to write a summary, which is just a short, bare-bones statement of what happens in the poem, we might write something like this: a city dweller longs to return to a peaceful life on the Isle of Innisfree. That differs from paraphrase that's longer and more detailed, and that you would also put in your own words. Our book, on page 7, has a paraphrase for this poem. I'm going to get up now, go to Innisfree, build a cabin, plant beans, keep bees, and live peacefully by myself amid nature and beautiful light. I want to because I can't forget the sound of that lake water. When I'm in the city, a gray and dingy place, I seem to hear it deep inside me. Notice how much longer and more detailed the paraphrase is from the summary. But of course, paraphrase doesn't convey the poetry of the poem, and that's one of the shortcomings. It's really helpful to paraphrase to get a better understanding of the poem, but if you really want to get the poetry, that comes from the various techniques that we're going to be learning all term, and that would give us a deeper understanding in this poem of the speaker's longing and why it might matter to us. In this week's Moodle block, under Recommended Resources, I've included a link to Yeats reading his poem in the 1930s. In fact, there are multiple readings of this poem, and you should definitely listen to that. It won't take long, but he has a very pronounced reading style, and you'll hear his Irish accent and pronunciation as he reads. One last point about paraphrase. At the end of this chapter, we have a poem by William Stafford entitled Ask Me. Stafford was an Oregon poet for much of his life, and in fact he taught for decades up at Lewis and Clark College by Portland, and he was also Poet Laureate of the United States. And he actually paraphrases his own poem. So I highly recommend you read his poem and his paraphrase, and then try answering question 1 under More Topics for Writing on page 18. This will help you see if you're meeting the learning outcomes for subject, summary, and paraphrase. You can listen to the next short lecture. It's in this week's middle block as well, and contains other information from this chapter, including information on 4 types of poetry: the lyric, the narrative, the dramatic, and the didactic poem.